So most of you know who I am because I've been here for about a decade. The first thing I would tell you is I am not a preacher. I don't really even like to think of myself as a teacher. I prefer to think of myself as a student who likes to talk a lot. So tonight we'll be looking in Luke chapter 14. But I have a couple of starter questions for you tonight. The first is, how do you feel about the changes we have experienced in our social etiquette? So if you think about our social etiquette, there used to be a time when we spoke to people who were more mature or older, or however you want to say it, as yes, sir, yes, ma'am. How many of you grew up saying that? I did, okay? There was also a time where, and I'm picking on Roy because he's right in my line of sight here, that I would not call him Roy. I would say Mr. Reeves, or I might say Brother Roy, right? We're all familiar with that. Things have changed. We've gotten a little more casual, a little more simplified in our language, but those things are what has happened to us. We have just gotten a little more relaxed. Some of our social etiquette maybe is not bad to change. Some of it may be making us a little too familiar with one another. So also, how many of you have ever received a written invitation to some event? And that is supposed to be blurry, so don't try to read that picture there. It's a dinner invitation, and it has RSVP at the bottom. You know, there was a time when people invited people to a dinner gathering, and it would say, the pleasure of your attendance is, or we would invite you to join us in celebrating, or something along those lines, and it might even say, black tie is appropriate, or if we go back 150 years, it might say white tie is appropriate, which none of us would be familiar with. But it says RSVP. How many of you know what RSVP stands for? Okay, I see 3 hands, okay? Respondez s'il vous plaît. That's a French phrase. Do you know what that is asking you to do? Please respond. And it literally translates, respond if you please, okay? Here's the trick. It means to tell me if you are coming, and it means to tell me if you are not coming. It means both. Now, typically, if you got a wedding invitation and it would say, we're going to have the reception afterwards respond to that, or RSVP, you would just respond if you're staying, right? If it's a positive response. But it means both, okay? So when we're thinking about this dinner, we need to be thinking about the fact that as we go back in the centuries, etiquette was even more strict. And the respond was even more important. And we'll get into that a little later. So also, I have another question for you. How does it feel if you plan a big event and it's not very well attended? I don't know how many of you have planned big events. Roy had a big party at his 80th birthday. Was it well attended? It seemed to be. How did it make you feel that it was well attended? Real good. Appreciated, acknowledged, understood that reaching that milestone is important. So if we don't respond, or if we don't attend, and maybe we get that RSVP and we don't respond to that at all, we should think about how that makes a person feel. As we get into Luke chapter 14, Luke explores some social reversals and contradictions associated with the appearance of God's kingdom. Okay? And just as Jesus did in the Sermon on the Mount, his listeners at this time are told or asked to do things that are outside what their socially accepted norms were. Okay? So that's how we need to think about it. In fact, the first 14 verses of this chapter is actually a prelude to what we're going to talk about tonight. And I'm just going to skim over those 14 verses very quickly. In the first century, eating together was supposed to be an occasion for very intimate fellowship. You didn't invite just anybody to your dinner. It was a matter of sharing life together, like we like to say today. So, treachery or even less than friendly attitudes when you were invited to a dinner would repulse ancient peoples. Acting out of character. I don't know if you've ever been to an event where a gathering of some sort where someone maybe had a little too much to drink. Don't know what your circles are, but some events people drink alcohol, and if they drink too much alcohol, they can, their personality can even change. They act out of character, or maybe they get a little too loud, a little too vocal. Maybe they say things they shouldn't be saying. That type of action in the first century would just literally repulse people. So as the chapter opens, Jesus asks a question that provokes these people and is supposed to provoke compassion from them in regards to this man who is afflicted. But the Pharisees who had invited him to this dinner didn't comprehend that because their lack of understanding was based on the fact that their religious views were based on exclusion rather than inclusion. And that's something we need to think about as we read through this, is the people sitting at this event would have thought of excluding the people that they did not want there rather than including people. Okay? The first emphasis really is not on Jesus' healing, but his authority over both the Sabbath and disease. Okay? Since this is the fourth time Luke has recorded the fact that Jesus has power over the Sabbath, this is certainly something that he and the Pharisees were in controversy about. Here, Jesus exposes their religious hypocrisy because they are living behind such a rigid code of moral ethics that they had forgotten human dignity. Even the man who had the disease has dignity, especially in the eyes of God. But they had forgotten that because they were in their exclusive looking at things. The following sections focused on Jesus and this religious leader and their views about exclusion in regard to relationship to the one true God. The next conversation that we read about is based on the behavior of these dinner guests. All right? Jesus first addresses the entire room because he notices that everyone is attempting to sit in a more honorable position closest to the host, right? And so he gave this assembled guest a lesson on the importance of humility replacing arrogance. Social status was very important in this early part of the first century, and especially when it was someone inviting you to a banquet. So typically no one of inferior social status would be arbitrarily moved forward. It was most likely that someone of higher status would come in and you would be asked to move down. That would be much more typical of what happened. And Jesus, in this, Jesus changes his social etiquette in that you don't set yourself first. We have to keep in mind that Jesus is never just talking about etiquette. He's never just talking about how we should act socially. It always has a spiritual nature to what he's teaching. This shows that because of their striving to get in the highest place, that they really weren't concerned about fellow man. They were being very arrogant and very selfish. Okay? The other thing to remember is that at a banquet, a host would never have invited the poor, the powerless, or someone who couldn't repay them. As we move through this first part of the chapter, Jesus moves from talking about humility in the first 7 to 11, and then he moves on to the host. Now he's talking about the invitation as a whole, and he's using social etiquette of their day to teach them a spiritual truth. So let's read Luke chapter 14, beginning in verse 15, and I'm reading from the New American Standard. And when one of those who was reclining at the table with him heard this, he said to him, "Blessed is everyone who shall eat in the kingdom of God." But he said to him, "A certain man was giving a big dinner and had invited many. And at the dinner hour, he sent his slave to say to those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is ready now.' But they all alike made an excuse. The first one said to him, 'I have bought a piece of land, and I need to go out and look at it. Please consider me excused.' And another one, 'I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I am going to try them out. Please consider me excused.' And another one, 'I have married a wife, and for that reason I cannot come.' And the slave came back and reported this to his master. Then the head of the household became angry and said with his slave, 'Go out at once into the streets and the lanes of the city and bring in the poor and crippled and blind and lame.' And the slave said, 'Master, what you commanded has been done, and there is still room.' And the master said to the slave, 'Go out into the highways and along the hedges and compel them to come in, that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of these men who were invited shall taste my dinner.'" Okay, so the man that speaks in verse 15 has interpreted the things about the kingdom in a much more materialistic way than Jesus has intended them. In this parable, Jesus offers a correction by continuing a basic theme of Luke: God's concern for the downtrodden and the reversal of roles among community leaders. We need to remember that there are always surprises at God's banquet table. As an overall statement, the ones who were expected to attend God's banquet had turned him down. Thus, God had every right to include others. He included the outcast of their society. And I personally love the way that Jesus typically takes the marginalized and dignifies them as examples and symbols of everything that's great in God's kingdom. Again, sharing a meal and receiving an invitation to a festive meal had a far greater and deeper significance in their society than the invitation that we might receive to a dinner. In the parable, Jesus chooses the flimsy excuses that people can to illustrate his point. As some background information, an invitation had to be given twice. First, the preliminary invitation was given announcing the event and requesting the presence of those chosen. But protocol demanded that just before the meal was served, a second announcement was sent by messenger. If a person accepted the first invitation, but then declined a second invitation, this was considered a grave insult. Okay? It was expected that refusals would come at the first invitation, not the second. Common courtesy demanded that the guests fulfill their obligation to attend after accepting the first invitation. We need to be reminded what a great expense and the preciousness of food was in the first century. Remember, people ate very small, very little, and meat was a rarity. But now he's throwing a great feast, a banquet. And in that case, he needed to know who was coming and how many were coming so he could butcher the right number of animals, prepare the right amount of food, and have everything ready for the guests when they arrived. Only serious emergencies would suffice for rejecting this second invitation. It's likely and was in their culture that the second invitation was really just a reminder that it's time to come rather than an invitation. They had already accepted the invitation. And there were no ways to make calls, so they sent messengers, right? Apparently, everyone accepted the invitation at this first stage. But then at the last minute, they refused. And if you look at these excuses in their culture, these are rather flimsy, weak excuses, right? We're dealing with people who had a personal preoccupation rather than a reasonable alternate priority, okay? So the reason they're flimsy is because none of their excuses contain something that was unexpected, okay? The land buyer may have been legally obligated to go and complete the purchase, but this man would have examined the land before agreeing to the contract. It was common that legal contracts often specified that the buyer had already examined the land. So it was just a formality that could wait until after this banquet. For the second guest, if he just had a total of 5 oxen, that would make him a rather wealthy landowner. That would not be something that the average farmer would have. So if this man had the need for 5 yoke of oxen, he certainly would have enough land, and he would have to have men to work that land. He would not necessarily have to work it himself. So he would have people who could, if it was just to retrieve these animals, he could have hired people to do that for him. Also, it seems unlikely to me that anyone would buy an animal without examining it first, or at least trying it out. I mean, we're in a farming community. People don't go buy cows just willy-nilly. They go to the auction and examine them, right? That's what you do, because it's not just a menial expense, it's a large expense. And for the third guy, he's escalating the insult. And the reason that it's more of an insult is because Jewish weddings were never an unexpected event. This was not, oh man, it's Tuesday, let's run away and get married. Didn't work like that. This was always arranged. They may have had a year-long betrothal or more. They could have been betrothed at an early age and waited for them to be mature enough to be married. Those things happen. So this man having a wife was not an unexpected event, right? And even if the women were not invited to this event, which they often weren't, then there would be provisions made for women in another location, right? So he would not have to leave his wife in a dangerous situation. He could bring her and have another location where she could stay while he was enjoying this dinner. When I think of this, I think of the fact that when any of us receive an invitation, if we're willing, we can find 1,000 ways to go. But if we don't want to go, we can find 1,000 flimsy excuses not to go. Okay? So, the reason these are poor excuses, again, is each person should have known about this coming. And not only are they excuses, they are an insult. Remember, he's already received and accepted the first invitation, and now he goes to the calling to come to the gathering, which has been prepared and is ready, and they offer these excuses. They are an insult, right? So it's not only an insult to the host, it's an insult to the whole community. It is basically insulting everything about them. These three individuals in this parable are likely to represent those who have declined the gospel invitation, declined Jesus as the Messiah, declined Jesus' teachings. They are people who have now refused that. The reason is, you look at this, the reasons are what? They are possessions, business, or natural affection. All three of these examples of excuses deal with commercial and family life, and it fits well in Jesus' teaching in other places about putting those things aside to accept the invitation of the kingdom. Jesus used these excuses to show that how many are snubbing God's invitation to his kingdom, and how snubbing the invitation to God's kingdom is an insult to God. Okay? Banquets were meant to honor the host, but these corporate insults insulted him instead. So I want you to consider that if good things can keep you from enjoying the best things, then those good things have become bad things. Because we have been invited to a new and better banquet in the kingdom of God. So my question at this point would be, what excuses are you using to not do kingdom work? If we are rationalizing when we hide our true motives and hiding behind nice, flimsy excuses. In this parable, the host is legitimately becoming angry because the rejections are both a personal insult and a public act of bringing shame on the host. The invitations to God's kingdom had been issued by prophets who spoke of the Messianic kingdom and its feast of good things. The whole Jewish people were invited by the call of Messianic prophecy, and since those days, they have been received another invitation, one by John the Baptist, and this one did not permit delay. Although the guests acted independently, their combined refusal seems to look like they were cohorting together. The parable challenges us to examine our own responses to God's invitation to his kingdom. But the emphasis in the parable is not really on the invitation. It's really focused on the positive actions of the host, right? The host's behavior would not have been socially acceptable to his own class, but he could recoup some of his honor and keep the food from spoiling only by getting at least some of the guests. The same servant is now sent out as a matter of urgency to bring people in, since the feast wait for the guest. However, the places they went to in town tell us that these were the beggars. These were the people who would have been originally excluded from joining the banquet. Okay? These people exclude what the Jews believed to be the outcast among themselves. These would have been the Jews who were not permitted to worship with the rest of the tribes, with the rest of the people. They would have not been permitted to come into the temple. They would have not been permitted to offer sacrifices, okay? Now, when you get to the people who are outside of the city, these likely are people who had been foreigners, right? The Jews did not normally put hedges around their fields. So this sending out among the hedges, as it says, or along the highways, as some translations say, that tells us that they were going out into the Gentile world. Those who were in the hedges or foreigners would have been even more destitute than those who were in the town. Okay? So they would have only been too happy to accept an invitation to come eat, right? So the kingdom of God is filled by willing guests, right? Who take the places left by those who are unwilling but have already received an invitation. Remember that the parable was spoken into a group of men who were under the mask of friendship with Jesus because they hadn't brought him to this dinner, but in reality, they were bitter enemies. They were looking for ways to show where his errors were. Initially, we may think that the parable emphasizes our earthly concerns overshadowing the spiritual call of God, while accepting God's invitation is to be a priority in our lives, especially over our temporal decisions. There are really two positive lessons and one negative lesson in this. The first lesson is to recognize God's concern for the needy. Notice that we too are called, if we're in the kingdom, are called to have a response and to take care of the needy, right? The second one is to recognize the movement of those originally called, the Jews, to the next level, those who their society thought were not worthy, to the next level, which is those outside entirely, which would be us, the Gentiles, right? Both of these show God's grace and mercy and how he opens up the kingdom to those thought by others as undeserving or unworthy to participate in it. The final negative lesson is the rejection of those who were formerly covenant people and now have become the opponents of Jesus and the gospel. It seems to me that every age there are people who, in their religiousness, neglect and exclude those whom they believe to be unworthy to be in God's kingdom. In this parable, Jesus emphasizes discipleship, presenting a challenging view of kingdom life for the disciple. While one of the themes of the parable is not placing one's property or personal interests over the interest of the invitation of the heavenly feast, reminding us that nothing is more important as accepting that invitation, the parable should also remind us that we are in a kingdom that there is always room for others, even those we might think are socially unacceptable. As in typical with Jewish writings, the conclusion comes before the lesson, okay? They often would give you the conclusion and then give you a lesson illustrating that conclusion. And the conclusion is found in just a few verses earlier in verses 13 and 14. But when you give a reception, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, since they do not have the means to repay you. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. So the conclusion tells us that we are commanded by Jesus to put those who need it at the top of our list. They are there because they simply cannot repay us in earthly ways. Now, when we look at the loving and generous to those who cannot repay us, rather than those closest to us, the response in return will really be what we desire, will be the right relationship with God. Now, Jesus is not prohibiting extending the invitation of the kingdom to our family and friends or those closest to us, but they should not be the only ones to whom we offer the invitation to join the kingdom, right? This should also tell us that authenticity in our taking care of those who need it should be part of our everyday activities. Okay? The parable is not just about this future heavenly feast, because we are experiencing a sampling of that feast today. It's found in forgiveness. It's found in peace. It's found in mercy. And it's found in grace and the sonship that we experience today. So we need to recognize God's invitation and respond deeply, but at the same time, make sure there's a room for another at our table. Thank you, and I will close this with a prayer. Father, as we look around us, let us be aware of the needy, the spiritual needy in ways that maybe we don't even understand. Help us to be respectful and honorable to them, because when we do so, we reflect your love towards us. We'd ask, Father, as we depart tonight, that we take this message with us and always look for those who can join us at your banquet table. We ask this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.